There are lots of problems created throughout history by people just not following through properly. Just not following through on what they needed to do, and then creating a problem which they cannot surmount later. In 1904, 5 and 6, the British created just such a problem. They created a massive problem for themselves. You see, the British had been resting on their laurels a bit of having a massive superiority. Yes, they've been investing in navies. Yes, they had been kept building stuff. But in a nice way, as technology had changed, as it had evolved, they hadn't been building realistically enough. And this is why we end up with the situation we do in this period. Hello. We're not live. There's no biscuits. There's no one to go to put PT into a chat. I'll give you a biscuit though, because I'm nice. The British had been seeking a solution to their problem, something which they could do and their opponents couldn't. It's a great idea. It's a sensible idea. It's a technological edge, right? The trouble is that the British edge wasn't really a technological superstar advantage. Yes, they have advantage in some areas, the Americans have some advantages in other areas, the Germans have advantages in other areas. It's a plurality of technology at that time. It really is. Everyone has their own abilities and their own things going on. And their own specialism and focus. And, it works for them. It does work. But the British edge at the time, realistically, was infrastructure. It was the fact that, in naval terms, they could focus on a navy above and beyond everything else they invested in. They really could. And they had justification to do so. They could focus on their navy in a way others couldn't. And that's one of the reasons why the Royal Navy, prior to the Dreadnought, had such an overwhelming advantage in numbers. It's hilarious when you look at the sheer quantity of pre-dreadnoughts, when you look at the sheer volume of them in service of the Royal Navy versus vessels in service of other navies. It's almost a horrendous joke. But the thing is, the Liberal government had come to power and they wanted to save money. They didn't want to reduce Britain's power by one iota. They didn't want to reduce the empire by one iota. They didn't want to back down from any of the foreign policy status or position by one iota. But they didn't want to keep spending the same money on it. In simple terms, they're like me. I love this iron brew. I love drinking it. It's wonderful. But if I wasn't prepared to go to the gym, or do the other exercises I do, and brush my teeth, and all the other things I need to do to compensate for the fact that I love drinking this soft drink, this particular fizzy soft drink, I would be in a really bad state. They are doing the government equivalent of, we still want to have all the drinks we want to have. We want to have all the chocolate biscuits, all the cake, all the desserts we want. We want to skip leg day. They still want to have all the luxuries in life, but they want to skip leg day. And that is the British government's point. And the thing is, admirals like Jackie Fisher sell them that as a chance, as an opportunity. Yes, let's build the Dreadnought. The thing is, the Dreadnought is not some sort of startling technological thing that's going to be so far ahead for other powers to catch up. Let me put that in another way. The Dreadnought could have been. The Dreadnought could have been a startling thing which would have been more difficult for others to catch up. There is a triple turret available with Vickers. There is the ability to do super firing technologically in terms of raising a turret over another turret to fire over it. There is the technology around for 13.5-inch and 14-inch guns in Britain. Ellswick have a 14-inch gun, 14-inch 45 5. There's also quite a few 13.5-inch guns. So honestly, you could have built a 13.5-inch gun HMS Dreadnought with 5 triple turrets, and they would all be centerline mounted. You could have also made HMS Dreadnought 24 knots because of it, because she'd grow up in length but also reduce in beam because you wouldn't have the wing turrets. With all that scenario, you could have done that. They didn't. They tried to do it on the cheap. And it was sensible to do it that way because, you know, you could do it more quickly. They could get into the service more quickly. Not that anyone else was really building anything that was a threat to it, but, you know, you could build it more quickly and you could get it into service. But the problem is, the British built one of these. So they not only skimped out in terms of what they could build as the Dreadnought, they also skimped out in terms of the numbers they built. They built one. They then realised they needed to build more. They built one. Now, normally the Royal Navy, throughout history, when you consider it still doing these great leaps forwards, normally the standard rule is you build 2 ships at least. 2 ships at the minimum. Why? Because if the build mucks up and goes wrong, you then have a second one to check out design, so you know if the problems are actually problems with the design or problems with the build. That's why you build 2 ships with separate builders. Every single time. HMS Warrior, Black Prince, all these ships, if you go back through the Royal Navy technological points, they build 2 ships. And suddenly they build 1. And they sort of freeze. They really do freeze. And you can tell they freeze because even despite the massive amount of stockpiling that had gone on before HMS Dreadnought herself is built, although they only started that work even in May 1905, she's laid down in October 1905, properly, officially, at Portsmouth. And they then build her at an accelerated pace. They double shift, which is not unprecedented, but it does push things on. And then she's launched in February 1906, and she enters service very soon afterwards. She starts service in October 1906. That's incredibly quick. The thing is, they'd been planning that whole build process since 1904. So, if they've been planning that since pretty much, you could argue, October 1904, that's when Fisher is first appointed as first Sea Lord and first starts pushing the idea and pushing the Admiralty and the third Sea Lord to look at design studies. And by the way, those design studies are really interesting reads because it does show that HMS Dreadnought is literally them going for a middle-of-the-pack option. They are going for a literal middle-of-the-pack option of what Britain could build. Well, you have a problem here. Because if that is what you're laying down and building in a year, great, you've now got 1 ship, which could theoretically be overwhelmed by pre-dreadnought, by the vessels which are being built before her. And I do hate using the phrase pre-dreadnoughts, but it is what the accepted phrase. I do acknowledge it. I prefer to use the phrase Royal Sovereigns, because I don't think things should be named for what comes after them, because they have no idea what's coming after them. And so, you know, they're not, when they're building, they're not going, let's build a pre-dreadnought battleship. No, they're thinking, let's build a Royal Sovereign-style battleship. But that's a vessel which has sort of defined the mould of the modern battleships in that period. So, you know, this is why I don't like pre-dreadnoughts as a phraseology. But the thing is, so then they go, hang on, are we going to copy and paste to quickly build a ship? No, we're not. And the fact is they've ordered only 1, and then when they're looking at ordering 4 more Bellerophons, don't worry, the Liberal government has another bright ear. They cut 1. They cut 1. Basically, as soon as the Admiralty has a plan for building 4 battleships in a 1906-1907 program. 4. The Liberal government cuts them. They decide to cut one. Now, believe it or not, the Bellerophon is not cutting and pasting the design from the Dreadnought. In fact, if anything, it's closer to, again, some of the designs in the studies. But once again, Jackie Fisher gets in the way of superfiring and a few other things. Jackie Fisher really doesn't think superfiring is viable and will consistently argue on that front. And it takes a long while for him to get convinced it does work. And the thing is, he is such a dominant political force within the Royal Navy that he can push these things. And he can keep pushing them. And the problem is that, in some ways, Fisher's long-term opponent, Beresford, was actually right. Because Beresford's main critique of the Dreadnought program had been, okay, A, this immediately erased our massive advantage in pre-Dreadnoughts, but people are probably going to do that. So why didn't you build enough? If you're raising our advantage in numbers, and our massive technological advantage realistically is our infrastructure and our ability to produce ships, why did you only build 1 Dreadnought, and why did you only set off for 3 Bellerophons? Why are you hamstringing the Royal Navy? And you can go, well, you know, the government are doing it. The government are doing it, but we're talking about the same nation which a few years ago, thanks to the political campaigning of the Navy, parties who are supporting the Navy, when the Royal Navy asks for 6, the Treasury tries to push through 4, they end up with 8 capital ships. Now, I know I bring this up quite a lot, but think of that. Think of that as a scenario. Think of any other nation where this happened. Think of any other nation which has had a similar scenario, where the Treasury, the people in charge of spending in the government, have gone, we want a budget for 4 ships. 4. Navy has gone, well, we want to have 6. We want 6 ships. And there is so much political pressure on the government, they end up giving 8 ships. This is the world we're talking about in this period. So realistically, to argue for a 2nd Dreadnought, to argue for a 4th Bellerophon, these would have cost some political capital, but they wouldn't have cost much. They wouldn't have cost much. And they would have given the Royal Navy an advantage, definitely. Because let's be honest, if you have 6 Dreadnoughts and Bellerophons and 4 Invincibles built as quickly as that would be, because that would be sensible, not 3 Invincibles but 4 Invincibles, a full cruiser squadron, and 6 battleships isn't a full battleship squadron, that's 8 vessels, but 6 is certainly heading up there, especially when you consider 2 would have been the experimental build, so technically you might have gone, well, the Lord Nelsons rounded out to 8. That would have put the Royal Navy in a fairly strong position, especially if you consider that Germany would have only commissioned 2 of the Nassau class by 1909, in fact, November and October 1909, whereas with the Bellerophons in, the Royal Navy would have had them all in and had been up to that 6 ships probably by June, July 1909. That would have meant the Royal Navy had 6 to Germany's ability to build 2. That's going to give them a firmer footing. That's going to give them more confidence. And the thing is about defense, about weaponry, and about firepower, and about all the things that go up to make an armed forces an effective armed forces, is it gives a nation confidence when it comes to foreign policy. When it comes to domestic policy, what gives the government confidence is opinion poll numbers, and whether or not they think they're in the right, and all these things. When it comes to foreign policy, what gives them confidence is the ability to do something. If they've got a strong economy, then they can do economic sanctions. If they've got a strong, flexible armed forces, they can do something if they need to. Usually with navies, they can do a lot more smart power than they have to do hard power. With armies, it tends to be a case of you're rolling into and taking territory. Aircraft, you're launching strikes. With ships, you can have them go and do port visits more easily. You can just go and do port visits to their neighbours, all sorts of things without actually deploying forces. Nothing that anyone can really object to, because you're just being neighbourly. You're just being diplomatic, going around and having a load of parties. Nothing rude about it, nothing you can take aggression from it. We're just having parties and having with our friends. That's the thing. Those ships generate that confidence. And again, it has to be emphasised, again, when we consider that the Royal Navy then builds the St Vincent class, and again they're a group of 3 ships rather than 4, again, and the St Vincents are generation 1.5 in many ways. They are all commissioned very early in 1910, alongside pretty much the next 2 of the Nassaus. But realistically, if they had been 4 and 4 and 2, the Royal Navy would have had 10 battleships, and the Germans would have had 4. The Royal Navy would have had 4 battle cruisers in service. The Germans wouldn't have had any at that point. Von der Tann only commissions in September 1910, and realistically, she's a late 1910. She is far later than that in terms of achieving operational effectiveness. And yes, she's a far better ship than the Invincibles. Please don't get me wrong. But in terms of deterrence capability, in terms of presence around the world, numbers count. Numbers count. It's the same with Nassau's. You can argue about whether they are better than the Royal Navy's ships or not. But again, numbers count. And the realistic thing is, the Liberal government, the British government, and the Navy in terms of not, well, Fisher in terms of not putting out the political capital to do it, means that the Royal Navy, instead of having 10 ships, has 7. To counter 4. 10 ships, if we consider in terms of capability, what does that equal in terms of likely availability of ships? Usually we would go for every 3 ships you can guarantee one available. You'll have 1 available. For 4, usually you'll have 2 available. If you've got 10, the odds are you're going to have about 6 available for combat operations at any one point. The reason is, especially if you're keeping them domestically in the UK, they're not going to have long patrols to go to. Again, these are battleships. They tend to be used for exercises, fighting, but they don't tend to be doing a lot of presence missions. That's going to be the battle cruisers wandering off doing that, so that's a different scenario. But basically, if you think about it from that perspective, if you've built 10, that means you've always got 6 available, and that means that under any circumstance, it doesn't matter when it happens or what happens, if the Germans manage to get all 4 available, you still outnumber them 3-2. You still have a margin of superiority in terms of your numbers available. And that's confidence. That is confidence. Now the thing is, neither the Bellerophons, and definitely not St Vincent's which come after them, are copies and pastes of Dreadnought. They aren't. Even something as simple as these designs show you that there's been changes made. That they've done further studies. That honestly, some people have managed to get in there and make some improvements, often in the face of Fisher, but also others, and primarily disowned to the Director of Naval Construction at the time. He does a good job. Sir Philip Watts was a capable gentleman, and advised by, I think by this point, Rear Admiral William Pakenham, and Jellicoe, and a few others who got involved, he was making some changes. Now, one of the first changes was that Fisher had insisted on going through 4, and you can understand this for Dreadnought, he insisted on going through Vickers to order the boilers and the engines, and the machinery, and the prime contractor, Vickers, Sons and Maxim. And they're a good company. They are. They are a capable company. But they had no experience. They then ordered it from Parsons. And the thing is, this might have been to get themselves some profit, etc., because whilst the Vickers produced their boilers and Parsons produced the turbines. But the thing is, it was well known at the point that Yarrow's produced the better high-pressure turbine boilers at this point, and Parsons was actually working with them. And one of the interesting scenarios you have as an option, which you could have seen route, is if you'd followed with Sir Philip Watts and a few others' ideas, you'd have probably approached the machinery by making Parsons the prime contractor for them. They'd done it before for smaller ships, but never for a battleship. And again, Fisher is a very conservative visionary. He always goes for the minimal advancement forward that actually is a recognisable advancement, not the maximal. But there is the scenario where if you go to Parsons and you ask them for it, well, Parsons are not going to settle for a 21 knot advantage. They would want a 24 knot advantage. Why? Because that would really show the capability of turbines. You see, at 21 knots, triple expansion engines are still competitive. At 21 knots, triple expansion engines can still play. They can still compete. Once you get above 21 knots, that's when the turbine really starts to have its advantage. So honestly, there's a lot of people who have been pushing for more. And again, you see this as different. We start to look at the Bellerophon class because, again, these are powered by Parsons direct drive steam turbines. And the water tube boilers they get, well, they have a working pressure of 235 psi. And what's interesting about this is that, once again, there has been some playing about, but there's a reason for playing about in this case. You see, Dreadnought had 250 psi Babcock and Wilcox boilers. And they're lovely systems, they really are. But the whole point was they'd gone with the slightly lower pressure boilers that they could get from other builders because they wanted to try and get the capability built up for other yards building these boilers. So they set off for 235 psi. Plus, they'd found out that even though the Bellerophons are larger, even though they are bigger in almost every single way and heavier, they could be made to match the same speed as the Dreadnought, and despite that, they'd have the same horsepower rating. After all, Dreadnought had 23,000 shaft horsepower. So did the Bellerophons, despite the fact that they have lower pressure boilers, because the boilers they're made to work with are actually more efficient with the turbines that they're being matched with. So here's the thing. It's not just about having a higher pressure boiler, you have to have the turbine to match it. You have to have the high pressure turbine to match it. And I've talked about this a few times recently, but there was a whole video about what happens if you have higher pressure boilers, how does that affect things on my channel, a patron question. So I did a whole video deep dive of what high pressure boilers could really provide. But the criteria is always, and I mentioned this in the video, is having turbines that can work with that pressure efficiently. Now, this is the point at which my father, who was a naval architect when he explained this, started talking to me about blade tuning and all the high-level mathematics which go into that in terms of making a turbine work. I can honestly say that for the 11-year-old me at that time, a lot of it did go over my head, and as I've looked into it over the years, basically it comes down to this, and there's a lot of mathematics behind this, which I'm not going to get into because the mathematics and me are not necessarily good friends, and I'm certainly not in a place to teach that mathematics. I would want a mathematician or an engineer here to do that one. But as I see it, it comes down to this. The shaping of the blades, the angle of the blades, and the positioning of the blades all has an effect, a number of blades in the turbine, on etc., and type of turbine blades, all have an effect on how it can absorb and maximize the usage of that pressure, of that steam. And if you want it to be the most efficient it can be with the pressure, the PSI of the steam, the power of the steam coming out, it's got to be tuned correctly. This is also one of the reasons why you would have later on in ships cruising turbines for when you have less pressure boilers, and then high-speed turbines, which are able to get the maximum energy out of the boilers when they're all running at their maximum. So there is a very real scenario going on here of Dreadnought's turbines were not tuned quite right because they didn't quite select the correct turbines for the correct boilers. And that's another really interesting scenario here, because in some ways they are making Bellerophon 23,000 horsepower to match Dreadnought so that they can match them on speed and have a consistent battle line. But realistically, because Dreadnought herself was to extent not as efficient as she could have been, they are actually derating their subsequent designs to fit with her. They are derating them because they are bigger, they could get more out of them. They do have space, they have more efficient turbines, they have more efficient boilers. They could have gone for 250 horsepower, 250 psi boilers, or maybe 270. Those are an option at this point, and have put in turbines to match. But then, in that case, they'd have probably got enough horsepower that they'd have been faster than Dreadnought, and that would have caused them problems. This is the reality the Royal Navy is dealing with in this time period. It's also why Dreadnought's sort of 21.6 knots officially. The Bellerophons are 21 knots officially. The St. Vincent's are 21.7 knots officially. And then you sort of get Neptune, 21 knots officially. And all these things, the speeds keep going up and down slightly because it's very easy for ships to be faster than those 21 knots for the Royal Navy with the industry and infrastructure they have at their disposal. And this really caused a massive debate when you got to the Orions, because there was a huge debate as to whether or not they should be left at 21 knots, or as long with the increase in guns up to 13.5 inch, and the other things they were doing with them, whether it would be worthwhile stepping up in a speed advantage. But the thing was, would that disjoint your battle line? Would that make your battle line not be as strong and as capable? And the thing is, Tsushima had been an artillery battle. And this is where Pakenham's influence is both for good and for ill. Because Tsushima's been an artillery battle, where it's about the cohesion of the Japanese force versus the disjointedness of the Russian force, which really did allow the Japanese to dominate the Russians and body slam them the way they did at Tsushima. Okay? That is rare that you have such a battle. But that means a lot of nations start concentrating on having a cohesive battle line. One of the reasons why the Americans are doing the same, because the Americans are also not building the best ships they can do. Let's be honest, the standards are a consistent limitation, because they're trying to make them to a standard. That is about building a cohesive battle line. That is Tsushima thinking. So the Bellerophons aren't copies and pastes, but they are an attempt to remake a slightly better Dreadnought. A slightly better Dreadnought in so many ways. They weren't, though, a panic build. In which case, why am I asking this question? Well, because it comes up. And as I've said already, the fact is the Liberal government actually cut the class from 4 to 3 in June 1906 before they even ordered them. The thing is, the Bellerophons aren't a panic build. The Bellerophons are a planned build. They were planning to build 4 battleships that year. They were planning. That was the... Believe it or not, that's the Royal Navy constant at that time. Roughly 4 battleships a year. And that's how they kept going. That's one of the reasons which is so weird with HMS Dreadnought. Because they are building 2 Lord Nelsons. So they should have been building 2 Dreadnoughts. But it's about saving money. So let's see if we can build just 3. And then next year, let's build 3 again. And then let's build 3 again. And then they sort of look around and go, oh, frigate, now we've eroded our own superiority, they might have enough to cause us trouble, we're going to have to panic build! And then comes the Orions and the classes after them. And you could argue quite convincingly, well, these are the 12-inch battleships, they're less capable, etc., all these things, and you would not be wrong, okay? You would not be wrong. In terms of time, by the time you get to the Battle of Jutland, having 3 extra 12-inch battleships wandering around is not going to help anyone too much in terms of the Royal Navy's actual fighting capabilities. But it's still useful in this period. And they've saved 3 ships only to have to panic and build more and rush them through, because they've managed to devalue their position so much the Germans actually look like they're getting closer. When realistically, the Germans were never getting closer. The thing is, this is one of the really nasty things about the Anglo-German naval race, the quantitative race, not the qualitative race between Britain and America, Italy and to an extent, and Japan, and to an extent Austria-Hungary, with France basically going, we're still dealing with the Junicol, we can't match you, but we will, invest some more, invest. And the Germans going, please stop adding this stuff onto the ships and making them more expensive, we're going to end up in a fight with the army. While the armies behind them just, sharpening their bayonets going, that bill goes too high, I'm going to start sticking something on these packs. Don't know why I did that weird accent there, but that's literally what's sort of going on. Well, one of the reasons why the naval race gets as close as it does is because the British government in the 1900s are trying to save money. And they shoot themselves in the foot, they cause themselves a lot of panic, and they cause themselves a lot of problem. The Bellerophons aren't panic building. The Bellerophons are, we're building 3 instead of 4 because we believe in our superiority. And will be forevermore. At the same time, they're going, oh, we're worrying about the rising power of Germany. You're literally cutting your own ships. The reason they look like they're getting more powerful in relation to you is because you aren't building enough ships. And we're not talking you need to order another dozen. You could have just built 1 more in each class, and then you'd have 10, and the Germans would have 4, and under those scenarios, you wouldn't be bothering, would you? This is the reality. So this is why when some people start going, oh, the naval race was completely imagined. It wasn't. It was real. There was a real there was a qualitative race and a quantitative race going on. What was, to an extent, not so much imagined, but brought on by their own stupidity, was the urgency of the naval race that builds up into the late 1900s, early 1910s. That period, which culminates in the whole We Want 8 campaign, the we want a full squadron of battleships. All that comes about because of the cutting ships earlier on. And if you consider the costs which that then increases, it shows you that defense really, the claim of defense that it's insurance is never quite correct. But basically, defense is like spending on the police and the fire service, as well as insurance. Insurance is your allies. Insurance is you're dealing with circumstances that you can't account for, and you want to have something cool, and you're their insurance as well, your allies' insurance. But defense spending, that's your emergency services, who, when you don't need, are a load of people wandering around in funny uniforms, practicing sliding down poles, manipulating hoses, occasionally writing speeding tickets. And I presume ambulance drivers at some point get some peace and actually get to do nothing as well. I don't know. Most of the ambulance drivers I know seem to claim they're constantly busy, but I never get any rest. So we'll leave that to one side. The thing is, they're all doing various things. It's kind of like the ambulance service, I suppose, therefore, is kind of like the Royal Navy. Like the Navy. Even in peacetime, they're still working off doing all sorts of other things and going, we hate you all. The Royal Air Force is kind of like the police. They still got some low-level things, but it's only when there's a big riot or something that you see them. They're having to deal with a lot of stuff out in force, and then, there's the fire service. They are like the army. When you need them, you really need them. When you don't need them, please sit over there and don't just play with your large metal objects. And I realise that's all a bit of a jokey simplification of it all. I do realise that. But that's the point. You still pay for those things because when you need those people, you need them ready to go and ready to be there the moment you need them. And it's the same with the armed forces. But the thing is, the armed forces, kind of like the fire service and the police and the ambulance, have an effect on the ongoing world even when they're not working. In terms of the armed forces, they have an effect on international relations, on the confidence of the government, and on the situation in the world. In terms of the fire service and all these things, they have an effect on people's homeowners insurance and premiums, and their quality of life in terms of, do you feel safe wandering around in your area? Is there enough of a police presence that you feel safe? Do you feel like if there's an accident, you will get fire service will come out? How close are they going to be? Do you need to have hoses and hydrants yourself set up, or can you rely on the fire service coming out? All these things have little impacts. They have impacts, and it's the same with armed forces. So the Bellerophons aren't panic build, but the lack of building them does create a panic. Let's consider their builders and exactly who built them. Now, this is always an interesting point when we get to in discussions, because Portsmouth had built the Dreadnought, and now they're building the Bellerophon. Devonport, well, they get Temeraire. They get Temeraire to build. This is Devonport, this is Portsmouth. And Armstrong-Whitworth in Elswick gets to build the Superb, which was launched from probably the same slip as we see HMS Uganda at that point being launched from. Probably. There is some movement of slips around in Elswick and some things, and it's fun to try and figure it out. But the realistically we're talking about is Armstrong-Whitworth get to build them. The point that should come across in this is not even all the Royal Navy dockyards being used, which could have been used at this point for ships this size, let alone all the naval yards, all the private yards that could have been used. So there is tons of untapped capacity. But what it also shows is at this point the Royal Navy is in many ways trying to dictate the construction of the ships. They want shipyards to be able to build ships of this standard and of this capability. They want them to invest to build them of this standard. Until they do, they're prepared to build them in naval yards. Armstrong had been involved in various ways in the construction of Dreadnought, as had Vickers. Armstrong now get to build Superb. They get to build Superb, which is superb. But the thing is, Bellerophon is with Portsmouth. So it's kind of a case of, okay, we already know this yard can build this stuff, so they're going to build a second one. And then when you start to look at the St. Vincent ships, again, they're built in Portsmouth, Devonport, and Vickers Armstrong, Barrow Furness. Oh, that's fun. So Armstrong and Vickers have both got ships to build out of these battleships, out of these Dreadnought battleships. Again, it's not going to every yard which could do it, but they're being spread about. They're starting to spread out the technology, spread out the construction, spread out the requirements of them. And it's about building up the nation's infrastructure capacity to build this next generation of ships, because there is a big step up between constructing some of the Royal Sovereign starships and constructing these Behemoths. They are a size leap, but they're also a qualitative leap, and they're using turbines, they're using boilers, and you've got to build all that infrastructure. And whilst infrastructure is an advantage, is Britain's technological edge, really. The fact that they can produce a lot of stuff at this point, especially in naval terms. That also means there's a lot of infrastructure you have to modernise. There's a lot of yards you have to modernise. You have to teach a lot of different groups of people how to build these things, how to develop these things. You're not able to go in and basically go, yes, clean slate, build brand new yards that can use the latest technologies to build the latest stuff. You have to go and modernise yards. You have to find a way to incentivise the modernisation of yards. You have to organise those yards. You have to make sure the technology is going through, and you have to make sure that they want to do it. And if they're privately owned yards, that's far more difficult than the Royal Navy yards. The thing is, Portsmouth and Devonport, the advantage for the Royal Navy knows is they are royal dockyards. Basically, the Third Sea Lord and the Director of Naval Construction go down and go, we want to use new high-pressure boilers and welding. Well, we don't... Doesn't even come up. It's, yes, sirs, it will be this much to upgrade to that level. We'll need to do this amount of training. We'll need to do this. Yes, there are going to be people who object. Yes, there are people who are going to say you're getting rid of our jobs and all these things. But the thing is, they own it. They're the owners. They're the people who sign the paychecks. Eventually, essentially, if they want to push it through, they can. And if they really need to, they have the Royal Marines sitting next door. They have ways. They don't usually have to use the Royal Marines, because usually what the Royal Navy does in the dockyards is go, right, yes, we're going to be using these techniques in building new ships, but A, we need the old techniques to maintain the older ships, and B, you're all going to have a chance to train up on the new techniques, and C, we're probably going to be building more ships, because especially if we have to start to rapidly develop ships, and rapidly build ship numbers using these techniques, you are going to be critical for it. Plus, and here's the other dirty little secret about the Royal Dockyards, you'd be amazed that the Royal Navy actually, to an extent, encourages some poaching from the private sector. I.e., the people who are working in the Royal Navy Dockyards, the people who are working there, maybe once they're qualified, they go and get a higher paying job in one of the civilian dockyards and take their skills with them. And that way they start passing the skills around the other dockyards to upgrade their capabilities. And you can argue, of course, that that works a problem for the Royal Navy, because that means they're training up people not to get their skill. Remember, they get to use them while they're training them, and all those things, but there is the advantage then that means that that's going to be another dockyard which very quickly has skilled workers who can do that kind of work. So you can argue which one's more an advantage for the Royal Navy. I would say as long as not enough people are taken from the Royal Dockyards, that they are no longer effective at doing what the Navy requires them to do, I'd say it's a net gain for the Royal Navy. It's a way of boosting up the capabilities of the wider national industrial effort. But yeah, Royal Dockyards, they offer a huge advantage in various points in history. And the fact that we got rid of them because of economic theory versus reality of infrastructure and reality of national security needs is something I find incredibly annoying, because it makes sense when you're making large enough orders, I suppose, that you are going to have a competitive market. But when you are basically being a single source customer to a single source supplier, there is no commercial advantage for that to be an independent company. If you are a company which makes something and you only have one client, and there's a company which buys something and there is only one company which can make it because of the patents and things they own, so only they can supply you with that equipment and etc. at single source, then you might as well be part of one company. And if you're not, it's probably for tax reasons, not for good economic sense or control or sensible management reasons. But anyway, Shameless book plug. Shameless book plug time, and well, let's see what I was saying here. Well, thank you everyone for liking, sharing, subscribing, supporting the channel, and helping it grow. Thank you. It's always very kind of you. This was a bit of an interesting video to be recording, because when I was putting it together, I was mentally thinking, when this video goes out, I could be theoretically having my last day ever in my old office, which, as you know, was painted orange, and it's a lovely sort of wooden office shed in the back garden. And yeah, it's a fun one to record because of that. But literally, I have managed to make that move. I have managed to do all the things I've done and continue on with this because of you and your support, because of your help and your kindness. So thank you. Thank you for liking, sharing, subscribing. Thank you for helping the channel grow. Thank you for all the things you've done. And don't worry, this space will soon be painted orange. I just have to buy the paint. It's going to be quite a lot of orange paint, but don't worry, it will be done. Because I like to be in an orange office. I feel that's more me. Anyway, the 1st Division of the Home Fleet. Now, interesting enough, they come into service, and the first thing they go to is Home Fleet. They're not divided up, there's not spreading around, there's not the traditional, well, the Mediterranean Fleet is the cornerstone of the Royal Navy. No, straight to Home Fleet. Straight to Home Fleet. Straight to 1st Division Home Fleet. Along with Dreadnought, they form a 4-ship division. Now, traditionally, you have 4 ships in a division, you have 2 divisions in a battle squadron. Okay, so that's how the Royal Navy usually works in this time period. And usually you would have a Vice Admiral in charge of the whole squadron, he'd sit in one division, and a Rear Admiral would sit in the other division. And so that's how they'd work together, that's how they'd coordinate their force. But the thing is, these ships are probably the most powerful ships in the entire world at this point. And so, yeah, the Commander-in-Chief of Home Fleet and various other people want to try and make each one its own. So it's always a kind of interesting thing to see if they're put together. But still, they are going to be used for a lot of diplomacy. And that's their other priority tasking. And they get involved in diplomacy from the get-go. This shows the importance of warships to diplomacy. When Cowes Week Review comes on in July 1909, and please do note, all 3 of the class had ended service by June 1909. You have all of them there. All are commissioned ships, all looking finery. You have these 4 ships resplendent. For when the literati of European nobility and international businessmen and their lords and ladies and all the various people come to Cowes Week, this racing week, this very important, still to this day, high status event, the Royal Navy was there in review. So that the Tsar, Nicholas, and the King Edward VII can wander round them and go, look at my ships, look how mighty they are. And the Tsar can go, yes, King Edward, you have made the point. My fleet got annihilated 4 years ago, and now you're showing me ships which would have just made the annihilation absolutely more effective. Yes, and guess who was selling them to? Will you stop rubbing this in? It's one of those days, but no. It was a very interesting event, and it's a very important political event. Remember, again, the Kaiser used to come to Cowes. A lot of the German royal family would come to Cowes. They'd be involved in it. They'd be coming and racing their own yachts. They'd have a presence there. So it's important having these ships there. They are a symbol of Britain's power, of Britain's presence in the world, of Britain's capability. Having those ships sitting there is a very nice, non-threatening way of being very threatening. Look at how many we have. But also think they could have had 5. They could have had 6 there rather than 4. They could have had 6 such ships, which would have been more threatening. Honestly, 6 would do it far more, wouldn't it? Because everyone can do the maths in their heads. And everyone knows, well, if you've got 6, that means you've got guaranteed 2 available at all times. Guaranteed 2 available at all times. With 2 and the another 2 probably in refit, so they might not be available, and 2 in training, warm down, those sort of things, so you can probably get them available in short order. That's the rule of 3. Again, you have 10 of them, you're going to have 6 available. But the point is, these ships assigned to this, it's status for them, it's quality for them. It's their value in the pageantry of naval power. And this basically sums up their role for the next few years. That's what dreadnoughts are being used. Increasingly, more and more dreadnoughts are being used as this. And you start to use the older dreadnoughts to go out to other places to be impressive. This is what we have. This is one of our older ships. Do you really want to see a newer ship? And it's about maximizing diplomatic power and the capability of them. And it's about strengthening the presence. Hello. Yes, again. Still not live. Still no PT available. You are really committed to this, aren't you? You really are. You're such a poodle. Now, for much of the period, they are in 1st Division, then they are transferred to 1st Battle Squadron. Although by August 1914, HMS Superb is the only ship left in that squadron. That's by August 1914 of the Bellerophon class. And Bellerophon herself, by August 1914, is in the 4th Battle Squadron. She's there along with Agincourt, Dreadnought and Téméraire. So, yeah, Bellerophon is there with her sister. And with her predecessor, and with HMS Agincourt to basically round out and go, look, does anyone really want to mess with this squadron? Have you seen the amount of firepower they have? Longer term, Bellerophon actually takes part in the Battle of Jutland in June 1916 as part of 4th Division of 4th Squadron. 4th Squadron has 4 divisions in it, 3rd and 4th Division, but, you know, they actually remain in 4th Battle Squadron, well, Bellerophon does, in 4th Battle Squadron throughout the whole of World War I. Superb and Téméraire end up, Superb ends up joining them in 1917, but ends up transferring with Téméraire to the Mediterranean in 1918, and Dreadnought comes in as flagship in March 1918. And did I say flagship? Flagship in March 1918. And then in February 1919, after war, the squadrons first dispersed and then dissolved in March 1919. It's later reformed at different points in history, but the whole point is they do quite well, and they are usually under the command of a full admiral, with a rear admiral acting as second in command. Now, why do I say they're under the command of a full admiral? Well, because in 1912 to 1914 and 1914 to 15, they've got vice admirals. But then they get Admiral Sir Doveton Sturdy put in charge of them February 1915 to February 1918. And that's a long stretch under the command of Sturdy, who does quite well with them. Yes, it is the least prestigious probably of all the battle squadrons to be placed in charge of. It's the 12-inch squadron. But they always have a very high degree of fighting efficiency, and it's often remarked how capable their gunnery is and how capable their organisation is. These ships do turn out very well. Other times it's under a vice admiral, but for quite a long stretch in World War I, it is under the command of a full admiral. So let's consider World War I and the Battle of Jutland and what Bellerophon gets up to in this period. Now, her World War I starts with the July crisis, and when the Royal Navy activates all its battleships as part of a test mobilisation and a fleet review in the 17th and 20th of July. And honestly, that's a problem, because automatically that's sending very pathetic signalling. It's, again, the British government doing the bare minimum. You were activating our ships and reviewing them. Yes. They've activated and reviewed. We're not going to have a live fire exercise in the middle of the sea. We're not going to do anything which positively demonstrates their power. No, we are reviewing them. They're trying to cheap out on the option again. It's what the British government's trying to do. It's trying to cheap out on the option and do the bare minimum it needs to do. After this, she's sent to Gibraltar for a refit, but she's recalled to the Scarpa flow on 26th of July, and then she collides with the SS St Clair off Orkney on 27th of July, but has little to no damage. In August, the fleet, of course, the home fleet becomes the Grand Fleet, and John Jellicoe gets command. It starts off being based at Lough Swilly in Ireland, while they strengthen defences at Scarpa, because again, the British government has been cheaping out on defences of Scarpa. Again, this happens every time. This happens so often it's almost a running joke. That basically in peacetime, oh yeah, Scarpa's going to be our main naval base. Do we need to pay for the defences yet? No, it'll be fine, it'll be fine, we'll do the bare minimum. Gets to war. Oh, frigate, it's not defended enough. We need to do something about this, And panic, and usually the Royal Navy loses something. In World War II, if something they lose is a R-class battleship, Royal Oak, which was actually the only modernised R-class battleship, which was really, really not good to lose. Anyway, November, they conduct a sweep in the southern half of North Sea to try and find the German High Seas Fleet. They don't find it. And Bellerophon was actually standing in the main body, trying to support the battlecruiser force as they go forward. But they're back in Scapa Flow within 5 days, realistically. In December, they sortie again for the German raid on Scarborough, Hartlepool and Whitby, but they failed to make contact with High Seas Fleet. So, on 24th December in 1914, that is Christmas Eve, they carry out target practice with what the 4th Battle Squadron does in Hebrides, and then rendezvous with the rest of the Grand Fleet for a sweep of the North Sea on the 25th and 27th of December, because the British were very concerned that the Germans might decide to deliver an unexpected and unrequested Christmas present on either Christmas Day or Boxing Day, because, you know, no one's quite sure which day do they prefer to open presents. I'm not sure. It's probably Boxing Day, but we're going to make sure by being out both days. Won't we? We'll make sure by being out both days. Yeah. Good boy. And it carries on. That is pretty much how the war carries on for them. It's a continual case of activation, training, firing drills, sweeping for the German High Seas Fleet, and being prepared. And while this is going on, they just keep working themselves up. Yes, they go for refits. Bellerophon has one between the 11th and 14th of June 1915, which does help her out. But realistically, for the Royal Navy and for the Grand Fleet as a whole, this whole period is one which is allowing them to work up to a very high degree of fighting efficiency. It really is, with Jellicoe constantly watching them and going, are you firing correctly? He was obsessed with gunnery drill and obsessed with making his ships as accurate as he could with their firing and as quick as he could. Not to the extent of the battlecruiser squadron, which of course goes for speed over everything because that's their policy. Although I have been dealing with some recent comments recently which are basically people going, that's the sole thing which causes them to be lost, not the bad tactical placement and the command positions taken. No, it's entirely their the gunnery drill, and sadly enough, that's not the case. There's a combination of factors which lead to their losses, because if they hadn't been in the positions they were put in, then they wouldn't have been subject to the results they were. So it's a case of, yes, bad gunnery drill, but like I said, that was also a decision of the command practice that was involved, and it was, someone put that in as a defence of BT, and I was going, I'm not sure that's a good defence of BT, but yes. So with that being said, she just carries on and carries on doing this until it gets time for the Battle of Jutland. And when the Battle of Jutland happens, well, she is ready. She's ready for it. Along with, of course, the 4th Battle Squadron, which was also ready. And during the battle, she would fire a total of 62 12-inch shells and 14 4-inch shells. 62. Of which 42 of those were armoured piercing capped, and 20 were common pointed capped. Now, there's a whole dispute. There's arguments that she might have fired 63 shells. There's arguments she might have fired slightly more, but it's not many more than that. It's definitely not many more than that. In terms of action, we know that she fired on the Wiesbaden. We know that she was the 14th ship from the head of the line after deployment, and during the first engagement, she was there. We know that she fired on the Flinger and managed to score a hit on the conning tower, which probably destroyed the rangefinder and B turret on the Flinger. And we know that she engaged several destroyer flotillas at several points with her main armament, because that's all she could see through the smoke. She is the 14th ship in line. All she can see through the smoke is that there's enemies somewhere, and she'll fire when she can see them. She's not just blindly firing, she is firing when she sees her target. And so that is why, realistically, she doesn't get that much involved. In terms of damage, she gets nothing. She gets nothing. She might as well not be there. And this is the case for a lot of the Royal Navy ships. You know, when we're talking about damage profiles, you start looking down the Royal Navy ships and you're going, not a lot of you were actually hit. Both sides are concentrating their fire on the targets they can see, which normally tend to be the ships at the front of the line. Which is one of the reasons why you do not want the battle cruisers at the front of the battle line, because they're the least armoured ships at the front, when they are, and they're restricted in speed to the speed and engagement range of battleships. It's not a sensible position for them. The British had worked this out prior to World War One. They'd done the exercises. It's just people kept forgetting the results of them. Even after the battle, though, she's still involved. These ships are still wandering around. They're useful, capable combatants. And at various points in 1917, she actually serves as the flagship for Rear Admiral Roger Keyes, when he is the junior Rear Admiral of 4th Battle Squadron. And then also for Rear Admiral Douglas Nicholson when he takes over. She does that because, well, HMS Colossus is being refitted and she's the normal flagship, but Bellerophon can do the role. She can do the role. She was fitted up thanks to her experience for Cowes a few years previously. And she takes part in all sorts of operations whenever they come up. Whenever they need the ships of the 4th Battle Squadron, you often find Bellerophon as part of them. In fact, though, Bellerophon becomes, after the war, a gunnery training ship in March 1919. And, well, she was thought thoroughly obsolete in comparison with the latest dreadnoughts, but she was still useful for the gunnery training, as she had a long experience of being a very good gunnery ship, with a lot of excellent experience and a lot of capabilities. She's actually replaced in the role by HMS Superb in September 1919, and then she receives her last refit in January 1920. This is a normal intercommission, standard in-service refit to just keep her going. She's actually disposed of in March 1921, and put this for sale in August 1921. She actually ends up being broken up in Germany. So, with that being said, what was her service? What was she for? What did she do? This is her in 1918 with a kite balloon also going on in the background. Well, she was a useful ship. She really was. So why has Bellerophon made it into key ships? Why has Bellerophon made it into key ships? Well, if I've done anything so far, I hope I've made it clear that key ships doesn't necessarily mean the glory hounds. Key ships and key leaders and key aircraft doesn't necessarily mean the thing which is the Spitfire of the world. It can also be the Hurricanes. It can also be the Boulton Paul Defiance, to be honest. Their utility is what matters. Are they key to the war effort? Are they key to national strength? And realistically, the Bellerophon class were. Because Dreadnought is not a proof of concept. Dreadnought is we've made this concept. Yay. Bellerophon's the proof of concept. Because at this point, and with the level of technology, you need multiple ships. You realistically do need that battle squadron as soon as you physically can get a battle squadron, so you can test out how you use these ships in a battle squadron and see if they work together. You can argue certainly that the government is positively stupid to only build one dreadnought. They are criminal to commission only 3 Bellerophons, and they are frankly bordering on treasonous to commission only 3 St. Vincents. Because at every point they are stopping themselves from achieving squadron or greater than squadron strength to be able to actually practice and test out whether the concept works. And that is stupid. Because in this period it is the battle line which matters. It's still the battle line which matters. World War I is going to be the end of the battle line as reality of fighting, but it still is the critical thing at this point. It's only once you get more free-flowing information from aircraft and the greater speed of ships and the maneuverability that offers and the greater firepower of individual ships that you can start moving up to the task force scenario, which we then see becoming dominant in training and exercise and development in World War II, and is the methodology we use today. But in this period, the battle line matters, and you're making a battle line of 4 ships, 7 ships. Your own squadron needs are 8. Testing out technologies, only building 1 ship. What happens if HMS Dreadnought had been a fluke? She'd worked well, but when you build 3 more, they suddenly don't work. This is why you build 2 ships. You test it out. The Royal Navy is in a really weird position because in the middle of a naval race, where it's a quantitative and a qualitative naval race the Royal Navy is in, yards are going bankrupt. Yards are closing down. The same's happening before World War II. Some of them have even been paid to close down by the British government because it was felt it was better for national industry if you close down some of the shipyards to make room for other industry. Which, by the way, very little of it, which had been actually been built by the time World War II came around, and post World War II, most of those sites were turned into houses. Nothing wrong with that, but they could have been turned after World War II into houses anyway. They could have been quite useful during World War II as shipyards. I know this channel, often when looking through history, it is very easy to critique governments in hindsight. It is. And there are people, and I realise this channel can sometimes come across as that to an extent, and I apologise for that. It's not meant to. Because I always try to put it in context. And whilst I realise there are channels, and there are people out there who will say, no, the government should be building lots of ships, I would love to have them being building lots of ships. But I can excuse them not, because no one wants to spend money stupidly. No one wants to spend money and then find it not useful. Spend money and frivolously and not need it. I can understand all that. What I cannot accept is that the number of ships we're talking about, when you're already building this many number of ships, we're talking about building 3 more. Over what is in effect a 6-year period. We're talking about building 2, 4, and 4. And that allows the Royal Navy to follow its own rules for how it tests ships out and tests designs out by building 2 of them. That allows the Royal Navy to build a completely homogeneous division and then a broadly homogeneous battle squadron. That's not excessive spending, that's prudential spending. That's being sensible. Again, there is a difference. It's one of those things when you start looking at this ship, because the Bellerophon's a good ship. It could have been better. The Dreadnought could have been better. They could all have been better. But they were a very conservative design and then held in place by that conservatism to try and make a standard battle squadron, and then they still don't get enough ships to make a standard battle squadron. They don't. They then get other ships which are in different forms and testing out different ideas, and you just look at them and go, yes, you're all 12-inch gun ships. I understand this. So theoretically you work together. But in reality, you're all different. They're not building enough. And it's after the St. Vincent's. They then have another idea for how a layout might go. And they first of all build HMS Neptune to that layout with the offset wing turrets. And then they build the Colossus class, which is another 2 ships, which have the offset wing turrets, but are slightly modified from HMS Neptune. And it's almost a scenario of, are you trying? Are you physically trying to put yourself into trouble? And then finally the Orions come along. and they build 4. A solid division. And then the King George V come along, and how many they build? 4. Another solid division. And then the Iron Dukes come along, and guess how many they build? 4. A solid division. Queen Elizabeth's come along. They build 5. They had planned Agincourt, but okay. They need some extra flagships by this point. And then the Isles come along. They plan to build 8. A solid battle squadron. They build 5. That's the point. You can tell when the British get serious. And unfortunately, it's not until the Orions. And not until the Orions they get the government on side with, we need to build at least 4. We need to build a solid squadron. A solid division. And then build out the next batch will be a solid squadron. We need them to be able to work together. And if you go back through those designs, Colossus and Neptune's, okay, you can almost call them the same class. There's slight differentials in them. There are some slight differentials, but they have some interesting capabilities. You could have, you're talking about building an extra 1 in that group. Maybe you build 3 Colossuses and Neptune, and that's your group of 4. If you've got 4 St. Vincents, and then 4 Bellerophons, and 2 Dreadnoughts. Your force is not looking that bad at that point. You've got 14 ships. You've got a little over a squadron. You've got a 3 division strength of them. A little over 3 division strengths. 3 divisions and a flagship. Couple of flagships, honestly. That's not bad. And does that cost that much for Britain? When it's already building the ships, it's already doing designs, development work and all this stuff? No, really doesn't. And compared to what they do build, what is that? That's an extra... Well, it's an extra 4 ships. 4 ships. But it also makes a huge difference when you compare the Royal Navy strength with the German strength. Just by ordering those extra ships, suddenly the German build-up doesn't look anywhere near as scary. And this is the thing. When Bellerophon is being launched, when she's entering service, Britain's still trying to play diplomacy and international relations and empire on the cheap. They are trying to play it on the cheap. And you can't do that. You have to either have to pay the bill or stop playing the game at that level. And if you really don't want to lose your position, if you really want to remain as top dog, as the primus inter pares, because Britain was the most powerful of the world powers at this point, then you need to pay the bill. You cannot afford not to. That is a very powerful, very useful position. Economically, politically, everything. It is an incredibly useful position. But by trying to cheap out on it, and let's be honest, again, it is cheaping out on it. It is. Because if we consider the price of these ships, and, well, even in the Bellerophon class, Bellerophon costs some region of 1.76 million. But Superb comes in at, depending on who you're believing, between 1.676 and 1.641 million. So realistically, a 4th ship is what going to be for the British budget at the time? An extra 1.7 million, roughly. That's not going to break the bank. And the Royal Navy has a habit of sticking these in reserve anyway. And okay, if you want crew, maybe you pay off some older Royal Sovereigns and that sort of level that much quicker. You pay off the older battleships that much more quickly. If you really do want to make savings. There are options. But they're trying to cheap out on it. Bellerophon was never, because of when the war happened, was never going to be on getting the hero status. She was too many generations behind at that point. She was Generation 1. Dreadnought was Generation 0. By the time World War I breaks out, the Royal Navy's firmly onto Generation 3. The Queen Elizabeths and the R's. They're the status ships of the war. The Generation 2.5s, the Iron Dukes, they're coming up. The Gen 2s, the Orions, King George V's, they're also going to be critical. The 13.5-inch ships, they're the fighting core of the fleet. The 12-inch ships, they're there as backup. They're there to make sure of the numbers. But the thing is, and this is almost today's question realistically, if Britain had built those extra 4 ships, if they had keep building them, think about the scenario vis-a-vis Germany. Think about the status of the situation vis-a-vis Germany. Because if the Royal Navy had commissioned 14 of these 12-inch gun battleships by the end of 1911, and the Germans had just got to 7 by the end of 1911, is there any scare? The Germans are running at producing 1 ship for every 2 the Royal Navy is building. Does it change the relationship? Does it change the scenario of Britain? Does it change the German scenario perspective on the situation? Because when Britain's not building enough, do they think Britain's quietly accepting their fate as the Germans describe it? And imagine it, that Germany's the rising power which is going to take over the world from them. They're purposely hampering themselves. They're not playing to their full capacity. For a cost of what, an extra £8 million over 6 years? The imagery would have been very, very different. Bellerophon was a good ship. She had a good record as a gunnery ship. She was the diplomacy status ship when you needed her. She was the warship in the line when you needed her. She was the muscle when you needed her. Was she the greatest design ever? No. Was she Britain pulling her punches? Yes. Was she a key ship? Most certainly. And the question is this. Let's say the British governments do spend those extra £8 million. They find it down the back of a sofa somewhere. It's a lot of money. Even today it's a lot of money, but let's say they find those extra £8 million. Maybe they sacrifice some of the older Royal Sovereign type battleships while they're doing it to pay for it, the bills. What do you think happens? Because I said, by 1911, end of 1911, the Royal Navy has 2 dreadnoughts for every 1 the Germans have in service. On that scenario. And all they've done is build 4 more ships. They go from the Germans having a 7-10 ratio going on to the Germans having a 2-to-1 ratio against them. There is an advantage there. With that being said, thank you. And what have we got coming up? Well, oh good lord, this is running behind. It's going to be the Battle of Dornach, when the Swiss go to war on 22nd of July. That's going to be a fun video. That's next week. Thank you very much for watching. Hope you enjoyed, and take care. Oh, and because if I don't say this, I'll be told off by Sal. If you like the video, please do like, share, and subscribe. It really does help the channel grow. There's a little button down there. And remember, the bell matters. This is the thing I say for all content creators. The bell matters. Whether that bell next to the subscribe button is filled in or what level of fill-in it is, matters, because that's you deciding whether you want to watch the videos or the YouTube algorithm having more power over it. So, thank you for that. Take care and have a nice day.